Hello and welcome to the history of Vikings. It's been more than 1,000 years since medieval Scandinavians left their homelands in search of plunder and glory, becoming the scourge of Christian monasteries and coastal cities, raiding and trading far and wide from Anglo-Saxon England to modern-day Russia, Constantinople, and the Islamic Emirate of Cordoba in Spain. The Vikings traversed so much of the world exploring and settling Iceland, Greenland, and for the topic of today's episode, North America. Medieval Icelandic sagas claim the Vikings reached North America around the year 1000. But what is the story of the Norse in this new world? What are our sources? Were there interactions with indigenous peoples? Who were the key characters? And what could have led to the demise of the Vikings in North America? With me to discuss this is British historian Martin Whittock, a historical consultant to the BBC whose books have sold over 1 million copies. Martin is the author of American Vikings, How the Norse Sailed into the Lands and Imaginations of America. Martin, thank you so much for joining me again on the history of Vikings.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, we're long overdue for a conversation, Martin. Our last interview on your other book on Vikings, Tales of Valhalla, was so widely received, and I got some requests to get you back on the show, and so very excited to have you here today. American Vikings, that's a big, exciting topic, not least because 60 to 70% of listeners tuning into this podcast are based in the United States of America. But Martin, where do we get the idea that the Norse traveled to North America and indeed settled there in the first place?
Any exploration of American Vikings has to start with stories of Vinland. Old Norse sagas, first recorded in Iceland in the 13th century, tell of voyages to a land that lay to the west of Greenland. And accounts of these western pioneers are found in two sagas, Eric the Red's saga and the saga of the Greenlanders. The earliest surviving manuscripts for these sagas date from shortly after 1264 for Eric the Red's saga and 1387 for Greenlanders. However, both clearly drew on earlier material and almost certainly existed as oral accounts before 1264. By combining information from both sagas, we get a picture of what the later Icelanders thought had occurred around the year 1000. And while both offer distinctly different versions of some of the traditions, these deviations do not discredit the overall account. And it's clear that both sagas draw on earlier oral material that was not always harmonised. They are works of literature in which material was filtered through the decisions of unknown editors, and the stories were separated from the events they described by, well, at least 4 generations. Consequently, imagination and artistry undoubtedly shaped their composition. However, while they differ over details, the role of individuals, and the ordering of events, they never disagree about the central claim that Norse settlers moved from Iceland to Greenland, and from there to a land they describe as Vinland. In short, Scandinavians made it to North America, and together these sagas tell that story. Now, the lands described in the sagas appear under the names Helluland, stone slab land, Markland, forest land, and eventually Vinland, Vineland, or Wineland. The location of each is a subject of much debate, but there is a consensus regarding their probable identification based on details in the sagas. The most likely location of Helluland is the east coast of Baffin Island, in the Canadian territory of Nunavut. It may also have included the mountainous region of northern Labrador. Markland, named from the Norse word for forest, almost certainly refers to the southern coast of Labrador. Vinland probably refers to the area from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to northern New England. The sagas say that wild grapes and wild wheat were located there, which suggests a location no further north than New Brunswick. Maine is a strong candidate too. The matter is further complicated by the possibility that the name Vinland may be derived from any wine-making fruits rather than grapes, but wild grapes are the most persuasive source of the name. A number of settlement sites are referred to by name in the sagas, and each has been linked to several possible present-day locations. But what is clear is that the Western explorers were operating at the extreme end of their supply lines and constituted a very small number of settlers. And it seems that Norse involvement with Vinland didn't end with the failure of the settlements described in the sagas. The annals of the kings of Iceland, for example, record for 1121, Bishop Erik from Greenland went to look for Vinland. This particular reference was part of a much later source compiled between 1300 and 1328, and it was likely based on earlier 13th century histories, which may have drawn on yet earlier sources. And several other late medieval manuscripts also record the venture to Vinland. The Law Man's Annals mention Erik leaving Iceland in 1121 with the enigmatic words Voyage of Bishop Erik, and the assumption is that the voyage referred to was to Greenland, but it may well have gone on beyond that to Vinland. And this attests to Erik's existence, Bishop Erik, and places him in the North Atlantic world at the right time. But it tells us nothing more about Vinland or anything else for that matter, which is very frustrating. As with the Annals of the Kings of Iceland, this source was written much later than the event being described, in fact almost certainly compiled sometime after 1412. Helluland then appears in passing in mythical sagas, which illustrate how the far west had entered a twilight world where history mixed with mythology. An example of this can be found in the Saga of Halfdan Eysteinsson, which dates from sometime after 1350. It contains an enigmatic statement that a ruler named Ragnar brought Helluland's deserts under his sway and destroyed all the giants there. Finally, the Icelandic Book of Settlements refers to a mysterious place named White Man's Land or Ireland the Great and its discovery, and it seems it was considered to be located somewhere in the vicinity of Vinland. What all this literary evidence reveals is that the connection of Viking adventurers with the North American continent did not end with the abandonment of a settlement there as recorded in the famous sagas, which tell of its discovery and exploration around the year 1000. The place continued to provoke the Norse imagination.
Fascinating, Martin. That's a fascinating exploration into the literary evidence for Vikings in North America. What can you tell us about the archaeological evidence?
This is really very, very important because it basically earths the sagas in material culture. Archaeological work in the 20th and 21st centuries has uncovered evidence directly connected with at least some of these voyages westward. And since 2021, we can confidently talk of securely datable proof that these Viking journeys took place. And it's in Newfoundland that the evidence has been unearthed. The site in question, Lance or Meadows, lies at the northern tip of Newfoundland's Great Northern Peninsula. After examination of the site in the 1930s, several archaeological investigations have occurred there. These confirm the existence of 4 complexes. 2 of these consisted of a large hall with a small hut beside it. A third complex was made up of a large hall, a small hut and a small house, and in addition to these buildings, assumed to accommodate people, a 4th complex included an iron smelting hut, which was built into the bank of a nearby brook and lay closer to the shoreline. The construction styles, combined with a limited number of artefacts, indicate the site was Norse and not Native American First Nations. Finds of wood and butternuts or white walnuts suggest voyages occurred to the south down the eastern seaboard of what is today Canada and the USA. Now, how far south and how far into the North American continent is a matter for debate, sometimes heated. What's particularly interesting is that tree ring analysis of 3 pieces of wood from Lance Meadows, that's worked wood from Lance Meadows, dated them to the year 1021. Overall, the limited number of finds from the site suggests a small community which didn't use the site for long. However, to complicate things, other research carried out in 2018 suggests that Viking activity at the site could have lasted for a century. As well as carrying out sampling from a peat bog, this work also applied what is called Bayesian statistical modelling to the legacy radiocarbon data from the site. This conclusion does not imply a continuous Viking occupation over a century. Given the sparse evidence left behind, this is highly unlikely. Instead, it indicates the possibility that occasional Norse activity occurred there beyond the early 11th century. And even when the dating evidence is read in this limited way, the result is still extraordinary. We can imagine the final Viking ships arriving at Launceston Meadows perhaps as late as the first quarter of the 12th century, having originally established the settlement in about 1021. And this possible 12th century date aligns very well with the voyage of Bishop Eric referred to above. While Launceston Meadows is the most famous site with archaeological evidence of Norse activity west of Greenland, it is not alone. On Ellesmere Island, Canada's northernmost island, finds of cloth woven in Scandinavian style and patterns, pieces of mail, part of a bronze balance, the base of a barrel, iron knife blades, an iron ship rivet, and other iron and copper fragments suggest trade between indigenous peoples and the Norse. These sites may date from as early as the 12th century. Similarly, at an indigenous site at Port Refuge on Devon Island, situated between Ellesmere Island and the northern coast of Baffin Island, part of a cast bronze bowl and some smelted iron were found and dated to the 15th century. Further south on Baffin Island, a carved wooden figure, which appears to depict a Scandinavian wearing a characteristic hooded robe, has been discovered. Finally, spun cordage, like that found on medieval European sites, was recently recognised during a re-examination of an archaeological collection excavated from Baffin Island. And since this discovery, similar material has been identified from 2 other sites on Baffin Island and another one in northern Labrador. These join a growing list of artefacts from tally sticks to willow baskets, which suggest they were made by Greenland Norse. Now, whether they indicate the actual presence of Scandinavians rather than items traded over long distance is open to question. What they undoubtedly reveal are the western activities of Greenland Vikings. And their reach might have stretched still further. At a Native American site at Naskeag Point in Maine, a coin has been discovered. Known as the Goddard coin or Maine penny, it is a coin of Olaf Kyrie, King of Norway, and was minted by 1080. There is good reason to consider this find genuine. The coin was probably, in which case, traded down to its find spot via indigenous intermediaries from what is now Canada, as far as Maine.
Fascinating, fascinating. Had no idea, Martin, that, one may believe that the Vikings were still, sailing sort of to and fro North America as late as sort of 1100. That's very interesting, and certainly the Maine penny is something that I know listeners and especially in the United States people get really excited about as it relates to this topic. What can you tell us about the key characters on the Viking side that we can read about? Vikings are known for their sort of larger-than-life characters oftentimes, but sort of who are the key players as it relates to North America?
Well, we certainly have some larger-than-life characters in the sagas, and a number of Norse adventurers feature in the saga accounts as explorers of Vinland. For example, the Saga of the Greenlanders tells how a traveller named Bjarni Hjolfsson was blown off course on a sea voyage to Greenland. As a result, he saw a strange land which was far to the west of known territories. Then, according to the Saga of the Greenlanders, Leif Erikson bought Bjarni Hjolfsson's ship and then asked Eric the Red, his father, to accompany him on an exploration to the west. However, Eric decided that he was too old for such adventures, so Leif Erikson set off, but according to the account in Eric the Red's saga, he, like Bjarni Hjolfsson, was blown off course, and he too came upon an unknown land far to the west of Greenland. Eric the Red's saga emphasises that it was in the newly discovered land that Leif found wild wheat and wild vines along with maple trees. Then there was the intrepid Gudrid Thorbjornsdottir, wife of the Vinland explorer Thorfinn Karlsefni, who was mother, according to the sagas, of the first European born in North America. Leif Erikson's brother, Thorvald Eriksson, also sailed to Vinland, as did Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red. She clearly had homicidal tendencies. According to the saga, in a dispute in Vinland amongst the settlers, which the saga evidence indicates she instigated, all the men in a rival group were killed on the orders of Freydis. However, there were limits to this feud as far as her male allies were concerned. None of the men in the group, led by Freydis, were willing to kill the 5 women who were members of the rival community that had been attacked. Finally, we are told, Freydis herself killed the other women with an axe. So these are just some of the stand-out characters for the Norse sagas, but there are many other named ones as well. But I chose these as these are the ones that particularly stand out for significance, but they are by no means alone.
Martin, what do you think? I mean, why might the Vikings have been motivated to travel as far as North America in the first place? I mean, why North America? What were their motives for that exploration?
I think it's a mixture of 2 main areas. One is accidental discovery, and there definitely is evidence from the sagas that initial accounts of the lands far to the west and getting as far as Vinland, were the products of accidental discovery, people in the North Atlantic world being blown much further west than they intended and coming upon this hitherto unknown continent. But also, alongside that, there is a general movement north and westward seeking products of the Arctic and the subarctic that clearly drew people westward from Greenland, having already moved that way from Iceland and from Norway. And these included polar bear skins and walrus ivory. So we need to remember, of course, that the indigenous peoples in the Arctic and subarctic were very skilled hunters and collectors of these products of the Arctic and subarctic. And these were very, very attractive products to the Norse. They were familiar with these things from Scandinavia and from other exploration. And clearly very large amounts of these products were available in the Arctic and subarctic, which drew them into clear trading networks as well as voyages to explore more. And that drew them, as I say, into trading arrangements with indigenous peoples, which do feature in the sagas. We'll touch upon that in just a moment, but perhaps don't get as much play in the sagas as we'd like, as the archaeological evidence suggests was clearly happening. And then these people were obviously living and hunting in the areas and had been living and hunting there for centuries and centuries, knew it very well. Interestingly, the sagas also refer to wood being shipped back from Vinland, since it's quite clear that Greenland was short of wood, and some wooden items that have been found there clearly seem to have come from the North American continent and were not solely driftwood. So basically, it was a combination of accidental discovery, of course associated also sometimes with exile when people were driven out of places like Iceland, moving further westward, and a slow sort of incremental movement westward, seeking the source of products of the Arctic and subarctic. I think those were the main things that came together to make the travelling to North America worthwhile and very attractive.
Did the Vikings interact with any indigenous peoples in North America?
Very much so. Now, the saga evidence indicates early trading activities with local indigenous peoples, the ones dismissively called skrælings in Old Norse. And the saga evidence talks about the trade being organised around the Norse providing milk, dairy products and red cloth, which is particularly attractive, in return for animal hides. And clearly the North American continent was very, very rich in animal hides and furs. We're told in the sagas that the indigenous peoples also wanted to trade for weapons, but we are told by the sagas that the expedition leader in that case, Thorfinn Karlsevne, would not allow this. However, the saga evidence indicates that in time, relationships with local people broke down. One, we are told, tried to take a weapon and was killed by the Norse. In response, the local people attacked the settlement and many of the attackers were killed. This particular battle was made famous by the actions of Freydis, the daughter of Eric the Red. As Viking men fell back in the face of the attack, Freydis, though pregnant, we are told, frightened the attackers off by baring her breast and slapping it with the flat of a sword blade. After this, Thorfinn Karlsevne decided that they could not remain there, for they would be under constant danger of attack. As a result, they sailed back up the coast, and, we are told, killed 5 of the Native American peoples that they discovered sleeping in animal hide sleeping bags. After this, according to Eric the Red saga, Thorvald, one of the sons of Eric the Red, was killed by an arrow. This is the same death which the Saga of the Greenlanders claimed occurred in another and different expedition. It's hard to decide between the two conflicting claims. But clearly the sagas talk about a breakdown in relationships and increasing violence, which includes a very high level of violence towards Native Americans by the Norse, as well as conflicts that were more complex than that. But what is striking is that the archaeological evidence from the Canadian Arctic and subarctic reveals that this violence was not true of all interactions. So the saga evidence can give us a very, very violent impression. But the archaeological evidence from the Canadian Arctic and subarctic paints a different picture, because there clearly was much peaceful trading going on beneath the level of the events referred to in the literary saga evidence. And this must not be forgotten when we're reading the events through the lens of the sagas.
Do we know anything about the demise of the Norse settlement in North America? Why do you think it might not have lasted?
Well, the sagas alone seem to suggest a limited interaction with North America lasting one generation. But as we've seen, the statistical modelling applied to the legacy radiocarbon data from Lonsall Meadows suggests that ships put in there for a century, and clearly moved further west and south as well, thinking of the Maine penny, for example, thinking of those wild grapes and wild wheat, which would have taken them down into possibly New England. However, the small nature of the Norse settlement in North America, the overall extended supply lines from Greenland, the relatively low population of Greenland to support the westward movement, and the resistance by indigenous peoples meant that this Norse settlement in North America was unsustainable. However, medieval accounts beyond the sagas, as we've seen, do refer to ongoing connections with North America well into the medieval period. And it seems these voyages went at least as far as Markland, for example, Labrador, probably to collect timber, a resource, as we've seen, that was lacking in Greenland, which could be found on Labrador in the medieval period. Voyages also took place to Helluland, probably Baffin Island. The intention here may have been to trade with indigenous peoples. The Markland reference comes from the Icelandic Elder Skalholt Annals, compiled around 1362, and under 1347 is an entry that reads, "There came also a ship from Greenland. It was without an anchor. There were 17 men on board, and they had sailed to Markland, but had afterwards been driven hither by storms at sea." This suggests Norse voyages to North America took place until the middle of the 14th century. But after that, the onset of the so-called Little Ice Age meant more pack ice in the North Atlantic, increased number and severity of storms in the North Atlantic, and what we now know to be the extinguishing of Norse settlement on Greenland. It seems clear that by 1400, the connection with North America, for a whole range of social and environmental reasons, was broken.
As a historian, Martin, I'm curious to know what prompted you to write American Vikings. What most excites you about this aspect of Viking history?
Well, in addition to a fascination with the whole Viking Age and the Viking world generally, two things kind of drove this book. The first was astonishment at the extreme nature of this Western voyaging and the challenge of testing the saga evidence with the evidence of archaeology. Secondly, a driving factor was the way in which, or fascination with, the way in which deep stories are deployed to frame and explain modern identities. The way in which the American Vikings have fed into the cultural DNA of North America is really fascinating. And this interest in the Viking input into modern outlooks drove the later chapters of the book. We'll explore more of that later, I guess, regarding the USA shortly. In the same way, as a matter of interest, this drove my most recent book, which is entitled Vikings in the East, From Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin, The Origins of a Contested Legacy in Russia and Ukraine. So for me, it was an amazement at the extreme nature of the voyages, westward in terms of America, eastward in terms of the Rus, plus the impact of this on modern deep stories and who we think we are and who we claim we are. And those two currents came together to drive the writing of American Vikings.
Tell us, Martin, about the research for the book. As you were writing it, were there things you learned or uncovered that surprised you?
Yes, many. But a number really stand out. I was surprised by the recent literary evidence for the longevity of the occupation at Launceston Meadows. So clearly there's been a long-term understanding of the sagas, but increasingly analysis of the other literary evidence has shown that there really is the possibility of continued Norse settlement into North America well beyond the year 1100, as we've touched upon earlier. So I was fascinated by the analysis of this other evidence outside the sagas, which show settlement beyond the range, beyond the time window opened up by the sagas. And alongside that, I was fascinated by the archaeological evidence for longevity of the occupation at Launceston Meadows, which of course ties in with that. So that was something that really stood out, how the longevity of the connection with North America was supported both by other literary sources beyond the sagas and also by the archaeology. And I was also surprised by the amount of new archaeological evidence for trading interactions between the Norse and Indigenous peoples, particularly in the Canadian Arctic and the subarctic. And that's particularly fascinating because it reveals a rich seam of information regarding peaceful coexistence and how it can be identified in the material record, many from sites which were not previously thought to contain Norse artifacts. And that means there may be a lot more evidence out there already in archaeological collections, particularly in Canada, which actually will point towards Norse involvement with North America that's been kind of lost or hidden within artifact collections that were assumed to be solely First Nations or Native Americans. And that means there's a real hunt for that more information as well, from artifacts, as well as from sites, of course, people hunting for sites. But just within the artifactual collections, there are probably Norse evidence out there because a lot of recent evidence has been discovered as people have re-examined those artifactual collections, which were in artifact collections for some time.
Beyond the Middle Ages, the legacy of the Vikings endured, and this is a fun one. In your book, you talk about myth-making pioneers in the Midwest during the 19th century. Could you give us a little flavor for what you mean there?
Well, here we tread on increasingly controversial ground, particularly as listeners from the Midwest will be able to attest. Okay. As early as 1773, Benjamin Franklin wrote to the Boston minister, Reverend Samuel Mather, that about 25 years since, a learned Swede had persuaded him that America was discovered by their northern peoples long before the time of Columbus. In 1816, the New York Weekly Museum printed a recent lecture by one Dr. Mitchell in the College of Physicians concerning the migration in the distant past of Malays, Tartars, and Scandinavians to America, quote unquote. In 1837, the Danish historian, translator, and antiquarian Carl Christian Raffen published the medieval Vinland sagas, translated into Danish and Latin with an English summary for the benefit of American readers. From this time onwards, the discovery of Viking evidence, and that must be in inverted commas, proliferated, the most famous being the Kensington runestone discovered in Minnesota in 1898, purporting to record Norse explorers reaching the Midwest in, conveniently dated, 1362. And it's not alone. Stones from Spirit Pond in Maine even include a map scratched into one side, as well as the obligatory runes. As with all the other US runestones, the circumstances of the discoveries and the content of the messages failed to pass the test of authenticity in the opinion of most modern experts, although this is heatedly contested, I know. What is clear is that the value of the Norse claim to primacy was that it predated Columbus, who of course had never reached North America. And his role in the discovery of the Americas was made even more contentious by a growing nativist, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant pushback against South and East European immigration into the USA into the second half of the 19th century. Columbus, of course, was both Italian and Catholic. Vikings, in contrast, hailed from North European lands that were securely Protestant by the time the USA emerged as a nation. It seems Vinland Vikings were also used to claim alleged ancient European land ownership. It's significant that finds in Minnesota followed the Dakota War with Native Americans in the 1860s, after which Scandinavian settlement increased in the region. So it does look as if we see an explosion of interest and then of discovery of Viking artifacts in order to convey something of ownership and possession of land in the Midwest, well beyond any area that we can plausibly suggest Viking settlers reached, although this is very heatedly contested. As a consequence, arguably the ongoing popularity of the Norse in US comic book culture, films, games and branding owes a great deal to a particular American interest in Vinland Vikings, alongside stimulus from the wider global fascination with the Viking Age. And in addition, Norse symbolism is also now utilised by some groups as part of modern culture wars. All of this is evidence of how much further American Vikings have sailed into some modern imaginations compared with their expeditions into the North American continent itself.
Fascinating. Well, as somebody who was born in the Midwest and still splits my time between my home in Nashville, Tennessee, and my home in Green Bay, Wisconsin, I can appreciate the lore surrounding the Kensington runestone in nearby Minnesota. Martin, you've spent a lot of time studying and writing about the Vikings, and I definitely want to have you back on the show to talk about Vikings in the East. What do you think they mean to people today? I've sat with this question myself, but why do you think so many are so fascinated with the Norse?
I think there are a wide range of ways in which the Vikings impact on modern interests and identities and fire modern imaginations. Consequently, that makes it hard to identify one key meaning to modern people, because this modern meaning includes their exploration skills, overcoming huge challenges, the contrasting nature of Norse culture over a huge diaspora, which has woven them into national myths and stories from Russia and Ukraine to North America, the dramatic nature of Old Norse mythology, the rich complexity of Old Norse language and literature, their success as a warrior culture, but also encompassing the fact that what we often call Viking culture is in fact, of course, Old Norse culture, which includes women, men, slaves and free, a range of stratified classes who interacted in the functioning of a complex and dynamic society. And I also think it should include far more focus on Christian Vikings, since the conversion to Christianity, particularly in the diaspora than in the homelands, is a hugely important aspect of the story. So, on balance, I think that the multifaceted nature of the Viking story is a major part of the appeal, because it allows for so many different approaches and areas of exploration. We can come into the Viking Age at so many different portals, via so many different doors and windows, as it were. But if I had to identify one reason, one particular reason for their appeal, I still think it's the dramatic way in which the Viking Age exploded out of Scandinavia, certainly as it's recorded by non-Norse sources. Now, we know it had a backstory that went way back into interaction with the Roman world, and it had an afterlife that takes us into the High Middle Ages. But there's no getting away from the dramatic impact of that explosion, as it were, from around the year 750 to 1100. And I think that whilst all these other factors definitely are in the mix, it's that drama that's a huge part of the modern appeal.
Martin, it's been such a pleasure having you on the history of Vikings, and again, I would love to have you on the show to talk about Vikings in the East, but where is the best place for people to engage with your work? You've now got 3 books out on Vikings: American Vikings, Tales of Valhalla, and Vikings in the East. Is that right?
That's correct. So both American Vikings and Tales of Valhalla are published by Pegasus Books of New York. Tales of Valhalla in the UK was published as Norse Myths and Legends, in the USA as Tales of Valhalla. So American Vikings and Tales of Valhalla, they're published by Pegasus Books of New York, and they can be found on the publisher's website and via their distributor Simon and Schuster. However, the English version, for people who are not in the USA, I'm not in the USA, who are looking out for Norse myths and legends, that's produced by Little Brown of London, but American Vikings by Pegasus Books of New York. These can be published via a range of online booksellers, can also be found on the publisher's website, and as I say, via their distributor, Simon & Schuster, certainly with regard to the Pegasus books. And of course can be ordered via your local bookstores, which I hope readers will support. And my most recent book, which is Vikings in the East from Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin, that's published in the UK by Biteback Publishing of London. So that's Vikings in the East from Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin. That's from Biteback Publishers in London.
Fascinating. Well, Martin Wittick, what a pleasure it's been. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the History of Vikings.
Oh, it's been very much my pleasure. Oh, and there was just one other thing. I realised, of course, that some years ago, I also wrote a book called From Odin to Christ, The Vikings from Odin to Christ, which talks about the conversion of Vikings across the diaspora, as well as in Scandinavia. And that's published in the UK by Lion Hudson. So that's Vikings from Odin to Christ. And that's another fascinating story, both at home, in the homelands and in the diaspora. And that's published by Lion Hudson of Oxford. So I should have mentioned that as well.
Excellent. I'll include links to all of those books in the description of this episode. Listeners are always looking for more good material to get their hands on for reading. So, Martin, thank you so much again.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. Vikings, the Norse, what a fascinating topic. What a fascinating subject for exploration and study.